They took her life, unaware her son commands the most feared Delta Force unit. The story opens with a stark contrast, the sterile, classified world of Delta Force Command meeting the raw, devastating reality of a suburban street painted in blood and sirens. The visceral shock of Officer Brian Mitchell standing over an elderly woman's body, clutching roses she'll never plant, unaware that the frail victim in the orange dress has raised a son whose green eyes have been the last thing 37 high-value targets ever saw. It immediately poses the question, what happens when a corrupt cop, protected by qualified immunity and a system designed to shield him, kills the one person an elite military assassin loved more than his own life? The robbery suspect's sneakers slapped against asphalt 3 blocks ahead, his orange hoodie a beacon. Officer Brian Mitchell tracked through the maze of residential streets. Mitchell's radio crackled with dispatch updates he barely heard over his own ragged breathing and the thunder of his pulse. The kid had grabbed $200 from a convenience store clerk, hardly worth the chase that was now demolishing Mitchell's carefully maintained persona of control. He rounded the corner onto Maple Street, weapon already drawn, safety protocol abandoned in the chemical fog of adrenaline. The suspect vaulted a chain-link fence and disappeared between houses. Mitchell fired. Once. Twice. 3 times. The shots were wild, desperate, the kind a defense attorney would later call suppressive fire, and a prosecutor would call reckless endangerment. The 4th shot found flesh, but not the flesh Mitchell intended. Margaret Johnson had been kneeling in her garden when the chaos erupted. 74 years of teaching kindergarten had trained her to investigate screams, to move toward danger when children might be involved. She stood, wiping soil from her orange dress, clutching a bundle of coral roses she'd been preparing to plant near her mailbox. She took 3 steps toward her front lawn, concern etched across her face, just as Mitchell's panicked finger squeezed the trigger again. The 9mm round caught her center mass, punching through her sternum and shredding her aorta. The roses fell first, petals scattering across grass she'd watered that morning. Then Margaret followed, her body folding with the terrible grace of something broken beyond repair. Blood bloomed across orange fabric, spreading like the sunrise she'd watched from this same lawn for 32 years. Neighbors screamed. Mrs. Chen from next door was already dialing 911. Young Marcus Taylor, no relation, just unfortunate coincidence, stood frozen on his bicycle, watching the woman who taught him to read now drowning in her own blood. Mitchell stood 20 yards away, his smoking weapon still raised, his mind racing to construct a narrative that wouldn't end his career before his pension vested. Lieutenant Garrett Hayes arrived in an unmarked Crown Victoria before the ambulance's siren faded from earshot. He didn't run to the victim. Didn't check her vitals. Didn't secure the weapon or establish a perimeter. Hayes read crime scenes the way accountants read balance sheets, calculating liability, assessing risk, identifying which numbers needed adjustment before the auditors arrived. He pulled Mitchell 20 feet from Margaret's body, his hand firm on the younger officer's elbow, his voice low and steady. "Tell me exactly what happened." "No. Wait. Tell me what you saw." The distinction was surgical. What Mitchell saw would become the official record. What actually happened was already being buried beneath procedure and protocol. Suspect was armed, Hayes coached, his eyes scanning the gathering crowd. "You gave verbal commands." He reached for his waistband. "The woman, she moved into your line of fire." Each sentence was a brick in the wall they were constructing. Mitchell nodded, his shock giving way to desperate understanding. This wasn't about truth. This was about survival. Hayes dispatched 2 patrol officers to canvass the neighborhood. Their instructions were clear: collect doorbell camera footage, note which homes had security systems, and ensure residents understood the sensitivity of officer-involved shootings. By the time they finished, 3 Ring cameras had been accidentally formatted during evidence collection. A 4th homeowner, after a pointed conversation about municipal cooperation, agreed his system had been offline that afternoon. The ambulance departed with Margaret's body, leaving only blood and roses on grass that would die from trauma before the week ended. Hayes planted himself at the scene center, his 43 years of age and 22 years on the force radiating authority. When the shooting board inevitably convened, he would be the first witness, the objective supervisor who'd arrive to find a tragic but justified discharge of duty. Mitchell's body camera would tell the story Hayes needed told. The original footage, showing a panicked officer firing blindly at a fleeing, unarmed suspect, would never make it past the precinct's technical review. Hayes had sanitized 12 scenes before this one. Margaret Johnson's murder would be his 13th masterpiece. The briefing room at Fort Bragg was buried 3 stories beneath Carolina clay, its walls lined with displays showing thermal signatures from 7 time zones. Colonel Marcus Johnson was studying satellite imagery of a compound in Alhasaka when his encrypted phone vibrated with a priority code he'd only seen twice in 18 years of service. Red flash. Immediate family. Critical. The message was brutally efficient: your mother. Officer involved shooting. Critical condition. County General. No details. No context. Just the coordinates of his personal nightmare rendered in cold text. Marcus's face revealed nothing. 2 decades of combat had taught him that emotion was a luxury enemies exploited. But his hands, those hands that could field strip a rifle in darkness or strangle a sentry in silence, trembled as he ended the briefing with 3 words: continue without me. His Delta team materialized around him with the speed of men who trained to move like smoke. No questions. No condolences. Just action. Master Sergeant Chen had a helicopter spinning up before Marcus reached the tarmac. Lieutenant Vasquez was already accessing Margaret's medical records through channels the hospital's firewalls weren't designed to stop. By the time Marcus was airborne, he knew his mother's blood type, her trauma surgeon's name, and the exact probability of survival for an aortic tear in a 74-year-old woman. The probability was 4%. The flight from North Carolina to the hospital took 3 hours. Marcus used 2 of them to plan 12 different contingencies, each one more violent than the last. The 3rd hour, he spent holding a photo of Margaret from his last visit home, her smile wide, her orange church dress bright against her garden's green backdrop, her hands covered in the soil she loved more than sleep. He landed on the hospital's roof. The trauma chief met him at the elevator, still in bloody scrubs, his face carrying the exhaustion of a man who'd just lost a battle he should have won. Colonel Johnson, I'm so sorry. We did everything. Marcus raised one hand. The gesture was small, but the authority behind it silenced a man who delivered death notifications to 70 families. When? 23 minutes ago. She was strong. She fought. Marcus nodded once. Then he walked past the doctor, through the sterile corridors, to a room where his mother lay cooling beneath a white sheet. He stood there for 17 minutes, memorizing every line of her face, every gray curl, every detail of the woman who'd raised a weapon and called him her miracle. When he finally left, his eyes were dry. His voice was steady. But somewhere deep in the machinery of Fort Bragg's most classified unit, authorization codes were being entered for an operation that had no name and would leave no trace. Marcus entered the 5th Precinct Station at 0847 hours, his Delta Force dress uniform creating a ripple of silence that spread through the building like a shockwave. The Navy Cross sat above his left pocket. 2 bronze stars. A Purple Heart. Ribbons that told stories of nights most Americans would never know happened. He moved through the bullpen with the controlled grace of an apex predator, his boots clicking against linoleum that suddenly seemed to amplify every sound. The desk sergeant, a 20-year veteran named Kowalski, felt his mouth go dry. He'd processed hundreds of grieving families, angry sons, weeping daughters, rage-filled fathers demanding justice. This was different. This man wasn't grieving. He was assessing. Target acquisition in a suit of army green. Incident report from Margaret Johnson. Officer involved shooting, 1,437 hours yesterday. Body camera footage. Witness statements. Marcus's voice carried no inflection, no emotion. It was the tone of someone ordering supplies, not investigating his mother's murder. Kowalski fumbled with the keyboard, his fingers suddenly clumsy. "Sir, those materials are under administrative review. I can submit a request through." Marcus leaned forward, his green eyes locking onto Kowalski's with the intensity of a targeting laser. He didn't blink. Didn't threaten. Didn't need to. Kowalski's hands trembled as he printed the incident report, the sanitized version Hayes had drafted at 0300 while Marcus was still in the air. In the detective bullpen, Officer Brian Mitchell watched through Venetian blinds, his coffee cup frozen halfway to his lips. He recognized the unit insignia on Marcus's shoulder. Delta Force. Tier 1. The kind of operators who dropped into countries that didn't officially exist and solved problems governments couldn't acknowledge. Mitchell's stomach dropped as the realization crystallized: Margaret Johnson wasn't just some old woman. She was the mother of America's most lethal living weapon. Lieutenant Hayes emerged from his office, his face a mask of practiced sympathy. "Colonel Johnson, I'm Lieutenant Garrett Hayes. I'm supervising the investigation into your mother's tragic." Marcus cut him off with a gesture that would have been rude from anyone else. From him, it was simply efficient. "The investigation is incomplete. Body camera footage is corrupted. 3 doorbell cameras from the street mysteriously malfunctioned. Witness statements are inconsistent with ballistic evidence." Marcus hadn't raised his voice. Hadn't accused. But every word landed like an indictment. Hayes felt sweat prick his collar. "Sir, I assure you we're conducting a thorough. I'll be conducting my own review. Expect federal inquiries within 72 hours. Marcus accepted the redacted report, turned on his heel, and walked out. He didn't slam the door. Didn't threaten. Didn't need to. Behind him, Mitchell felt the ice in his stomach spread to his lungs. Hayes watched through the window as Marcus climbed into a black SUV with government plates, then pulled out his phone to make the first of many increasingly frantic calls to the police union's legal team. The Reaper had returned home. And he'd just marked his targets. The surveillance began at 0400 hours, 48 hours after Margaret's death. Delta Force cyber warfare specialist Captain Sarah Chen worked from a hotel room 8 miles from the precinct, her laptop array glowing in the darkness. She wasn't hacking into Officer Mitchell's phone records or Lieutenant Hayes's email. That would come later, through proper federal channels. Right now, she was mapping the entire ecosystem of corruption that had kept both men insulated from consequence for years. Mitchell's personnel file told a story the department had worked hard to bury. 17 excessive force complaints over 9 years. 12 settled quietly by the city's risk management office, payouts ranging from $15,000 to $75,000. 5 others dismissed by internal affairs investigations supervised by, Chen highlighted the name, Lieutenant Garrett Hayes. The pattern was surgical. Hayes protected his officers, and in return, they protected the system that protected Hayes. Master Sergeant Vasquez had the financial angle. Mitchell lived in a house valued at $420,000 on a salary that topped out at $68,000 annually. His wife didn't work. 2 kids in private school at $18,000 per year each. The math didn't work unless you factored in the offshore account in the Cayman Islands that Mitchell thought was hidden behind 3 shell corporations. Vasquez had cracked it in 40 minutes. The deposits correlated perfectly with evidence room cocaine seizures that had been marked for destruction but somehow found their way to street dealers Hayes's narcotics unit conveniently never arrested. Lieutenant Marcus Jackson, no relation to the colonel, just another Delta operator with a gift for reading people, was on the ground, observing. He watched Hayes meet with a city councilman in a parking garage. Watched Mitchell collect an envelope from a bail bondsman who specialized in getting Hayes's confidential informants released without paperwork. Every meeting was photographed, geotagged, and cross-referenced against the precinct's official duty logs. The discrepancies were damning. But the most valuable intelligence came from someone unexpected, Officer Lisa Hernandez, a rookie cop who'd filed a complaint against Hayes 18 months ago for ordering her to falsify a report. The complaint had vanished. Her career hadn't. Hayes had made sure she spent her shifts processing parking tickets in the basement. When Marcus approached her at a coffee shop 3 blocks from the precinct, she didn't hesitate. "I've been waiting for someone to care," she said, sliding a thumb drive across the table. "Everything I could save before they scrubbed my access." The thumb drive contained the original draft reports from 6 previous, officer-involved shootings, supervised by Hayes. Before his edits. Before his narrative adjustments. Before innocent people became threats and murder became justified force. Marcus pocketed the drive, thanked her quietly, and added her name to a very short list of people who would be protected when the hammer finally fell. Back at the hotel, Marcus reviewed the intelligence with his team. They'd been operational for 72 hours and had already assembled what would take a normal investigation 6 months to uncover. Hayes wasn't just corrupt. He was the architect of a system that turned badges into licenses to kill and turned killers into decorated officers. And somewhere in that system, Brian Mitchell had learned that consequences were for other people. "We have enough for federal charges," Chen observed. Marcus nodded, his face carved from stone. They had enough. But he wanted more than convictions. He wanted confessions. He wanted the world to see exactly what his mother's life had been traded for: a career, a pension, and the arrogant assumption that some lives simply mattered less than others. The witnesses lived on Maple Street in houses that had become prisons since Margaret's death. Mrs. Linda Chen, who'd called 911, now kept her curtains drawn. Young Marcus Taylor's bicycle hadn't left his garage in 3 days. Mr. Robert Williams, the retired Marine who lived 2 doors down, answered his door with the wary exhaustion of a man who'd seen this movie before and knew how it ended. "Mr. Williams, my name is Colonel Marcus Johnson. I'm Margaret's son." Marcus stood on the porch in civilian clothes, jeans, a black t-shirt that revealed arms marked with scars from Fallujah and Kandahar. No uniform. No intimidation. Just the quiet authority of a man who'd earned the right to ask questions. Williams studied him for a long moment, then opened the door wider. "I knew your mother. Taught my grandson to read when the school wanted to label him learning disabled." Williams's voice cracked. "She was good people, son. What happened to her was murder. But you should know, Lieutenant Hayes came by. Made it real clear that cooperation meant problems for my family." Marcus nodded. He'd expected this. Hayes had been thorough, visiting every potential witness with the same message: the shooting was justified, the investigation was closed, and anyone who suggested otherwise might find themselves audited, investigated, or worse. It was a masterclass in witness intimidation disguised as community outreach. "Mr. Williams, I need you to know something." Marcus leaned forward, his voice dropping to the register he used before insertion into hostile territory. "Lieutenant Hayes spent 22 years learning how to scare civilians. I spent 20 years learning how to break people who make a living out of fear. He doesn't outrank me. He doesn't outgun me. And he sure as hell doesn't scare me." The words were delivered without bravado, without threat. They were simply facts. "If you have information about what happened to my mother, the FBI will protect you. I will protect you. Hayes won't." Williams disappeared into his house. Returned with a laptop. Pulled up his doorbell camera footage, the feed that Hayes's canvassing officers had told him wasn't admissible because of technical issues. "I'm former Marine Corps, Colonel. I know when I'm being lied to. I kept 3 backups. Local drive, cloud storage, and this USB drive I gave to my daughter in Atlanta. Hayes never asked if I had redundancies." The footage was devastating. Crystal clear, time-stamped, showing Margaret stepping onto her lawn with roses in her arms. Showing Mitchell firing without warning, without target identification, without any indication that he'd perceived a threat. Showing Margaret's body fall. Showing Mitchell standing there, frozen, until Hayes arrived and the choreography of cover-up began. "I'll testify," Williams said. But my grandson, my wife, they can't know until this is done. Hayes has a long reach. Marcus shook his hand, accepted the USB drive, and moved to the next house. Mrs. Chen told a similar story, intimidation dressed as follow-up investigation. Young Marcus Taylor's mother wept as she described how her son hadn't slept through the night since watching a woman he loved bleed out for the crime of caring. By dusk, Marcus had 4 sworn affidavits, 2 additional camera angles, and a 911 call recording that captured the exact time of the shooting, 14 seconds before Mitchell claimed he'd given verbal warnings. He compiled everything into a federal evidence package, encrypted it with the kind of security protocols most agencies didn't know existed, and sent it directly to FBI Special Agent Victoria Torres, who specialized in civil rights violations. Her response came back in 7 minutes. I've been waiting for someone to crack Hayes for 3 years. Consider this case active. Marcus sat in his rental car outside his mother's house, the yellow crime scene tape still fluttering across her garden. The roses she'd been holding had been bagged as evidence, then discarded. No one had thought to plant them. He made a mental note, after Hayes and Mitchell were convicted, he'd plant those roses himself. His mother had been buried without them. Her legacy wouldn't be. Captain Chen's fingers moved across her keyboard with the precision of a surgeon, her eyes reflecting the glow of code scrolling past at speeds that would give most people seizures. The precinct server was protected by firewalls designed to stop amateur hackers and FOIA requests. It wasn't designed to stop a cyber warfare specialist who'd breached Russian military networks from a tent in Syria. She entered through a maintenance port the IT contractor had left open, sloppy security that would have gotten someone killed in her world. Inside the network, she moved like a ghost, leaving no logs, no traces, no evidence that anyone had ever been there. She wasn't looking for Mitchell's emails or Hayes's calendar. She was looking for the one thing that would unravel everything, the original, unedited body camera footage. Police body cameras store footage locally before uploading to secure servers. The uploads are supposed to be automatic, immutable, untouchable. But Hayes's technical team had found a workaround, a 30-second window between local storage and cloud upload where files could be edited, replaced, or deleted. The edited version of Mitchell's footage had been uploaded at 2,147 hours the night of the shooting. But the original file should still exist somewhere in the local backup cache. Chen found it at 0342 hours, buried in a corrupted sector marked for deletion. The file was damaged. Hayes's team had tried to zero it out, but Delta Force Cyber Forensics didn't deal in maybes. She ran it through recovery protocols designed to reconstruct satellite footage from burned wreckage. 3 hours later, she had a complete copy. The footage was worse than Marcus had imagined. It showed Mitchell rounding the corner, weapon already drawn, trigger finger tense. Showed him firing at a fleeing suspect who was clearly unarmed, backpack flapping, hands empty, running in terror. Showed Margaret stepping into frame at the worst possible moment, curiosity and concern on her face, no awareness that she was in any danger. The audio was damning. Mitchell never announced himself. Never gave commands. He just fired. Then came the aftermath. Mitchell standing frozen. The suspect escaping while Mitchell stared at what he'd done. And finally, Hayes arriving and the conspiracy beginning. Put the gun down, Brian. Don't touch anything. When the investigators arrive, you tell them exactly what I say. All of it captured in high-definition audio by the camera Mitchell forgot was still recording. Chen encrypted the file and sent copies to 7 different secure locations, FBI evidence servers, 2 federal judges who'd issued warrants on Hayes before, Marcus's personal encrypted storage, and 1 copy to a dead man's switch that would automatically leak everything to the media if Chen didn't check in every 72 hours. But she also found something else while inside the precinct's network, evidence of Hayes's other 12 cover-ups. Files he'd kept as insurance against his own superiors, leveraging them to secure promotions and protect his territory. 12 other families who'd been told their loved ones were threats, criminals, justified casualties. 12 other officers who'd been taught that Hayes could make problems disappear. Marcus reviewed the evidence package in his hotel room, his face expressionless. Master Sergeant Vasquez sat across from him, equally silent. They'd seen mass graves in Iraq. Watched civilians executed by insurgents in Afghanistan. This was different. This was evil wearing a badge, sanctioned by a system that valued order over justice. We could leak this tonight, Vasquez said quietly. End them both before sunrise. Marcus shook his head. My mother taught kindergarten for 40 years. She believed in accountability. In facing what you've done. He closed the laptop. Mitchell and Hayes are going to confess. On camera. Under oath. They're going to explain to a jury exactly what they did and why they thought they'd get away with it. And then they're going to spend the rest of their lives understanding what it means to be powerless. Chen nodded. The evidence was secured. The trap was set. Now they just needed to spring it. The leak was elegant in its simplicity, a single encrypted email sent from a burner account to Lieutenant Hayes's personal phone at 0200 hours. Federal grand jury convening Tuesday. Witness testimony from Maple Street residents. Body camera forensics complete. Recommend securing original evidence before subpoena. No signature. No demands. Just information designed to trigger panic in a man whose entire career was built on controlling narratives. Hayes read the message 17 times, his hands shaking, whiskey glass forgotten on his desk. A grand jury meant federal jurisdiction. Meant FBI involvement. Meant the city's lawyers couldn't make this disappear with a settlement check. He'd spent 22 years believing he was untouchable. The email suggested otherwise. By 0430 hours, Hayes was dressed and driving to the old 4th Precinct garage, an abandoned building the department used for long-term evidence storage before budget cuts moved everything to a central facility. His insurance policy, the original, unedited files from all 13 shootings he'd sanitized, was stored in a fireproof locker in the basement. If federal prosecutors were building a case, those files had to disappear. Not edited. Not destroyed through official channels. Gone. Burned to ash in a barrel where no forensics team could reconstruct them. The garage was dark, the electricity shut off 2 years ago. Hayes used his flashlight to navigate the basement stairs, keys already in hand. The locker sat in the corner, exactly where he'd left it. He spun the combination, his badge number, because he'd always been arrogant enough to believe no one would ever get this far. The locker opened. Inside was a single item, his own dress uniform jacket, folded precisely, with a funeral flag placed on top. The evidence was gone. In its place, a card with 7 words in typed text, Officer Mitchell is already talking. MJ. Hayes spun around, his hand dropping to the service weapon he'd carried for 2 decades. The basement was empty. Or appeared to be. Then the shadows moved. Marcus stepped into the flashlight beam, flanked by 2 figures in dark suits Hayes belatedly recognized as FBI agents. Behind them, more suits. A camera. A forensics team. Hayes had walked into a trap so perfectly constructed he'd never even felt the jaws closing. Lieutenant Garrett Hayes, Marcus said quietly, his voice carrying the cold precision of a man delivering a mission briefing, you made my mother a statistic. You turned her murder into a paragraph in a report. You believed that your rank and your badge made you immune to consequence. He stepped closer, his green eyes holding Hayes in place more effectively than any restraints. I'm Colonel Marcus Johnson, Delta Force. I've spent 20 years teaching people that no one is untouchable. You're about to learn that lesson personally. Special Agent Torres stepped forward, badge raised. Lieutenant Hayes, you're under arrest for evidence tampering, conspiracy to obstruct justice, and civil rights violations. You have the right to remain silent. Hayes's legs gave out. He collapsed against the locker, his mind racing through scenarios, excuses, defenses. None of them worked. They had him. They'd had him from the moment that email arrived. Maybe earlier. Maybe from the moment Marcus Johnson walked into the precinct wearing a uniform that screamed capability and carrying grief that promised consequences. Upstairs, in an interview room Mitchell didn't know existed, Officer Brian Mitchell was already talking. The truth serum wasn't chemical, it was legal. His own lawyer had explained the mathematics. Federal civil rights violations carried mandatory minimums. The first person to cooperate got the deal. The second person got the book. Mitchell had talked for 40 minutes, his confession recorded in 4K video, every word time-stamped and witnessed by 3 federal prosecutors. Hayes was led out of the garage in handcuffs, past the camera he tried so hard to avoid. The footage would air on every news channel by morning. But Marcus didn't watch. He returned to his hotel room, opened his laptop, and began drafting the charter for a foundation that would be funded by every asset Hayes and Mitchell possessed. The Margaret Johnson Foundation would provide legal advocacy for families who faced the same system that had killed his mother. The trap had sprung. The Reaper had shown that justice, delivered with precision, was more devastating than any bullet. The federal courthouse in downtown drew media attention like a flame draws moths. Satellite trucks lined the streets, reporters practiced their opening lines, and protesters held signs demanding police accountability on one side while Blue Lives Matter flags waved on the other. Inside courtroom 4C, the marble and oak spoke of dignity and consequence, the kind of authority that couldn't be dismissed with qualified immunity or union lawyers. United States versus Mitchell and Hayes had taken 4 months to reach trial. 4 months of grand jury testimony, forensic analysis, and the slow, grinding machinery of federal prosecution. Marcus attended every preliminary hearing, sitting in the gallery in civilian clothes, his presence a silent reminder of what this case was actually about. The prosecution's opening statement was delivered by Assistant U.S. Attorney James Chen, a man whose conviction rate was legendary for a reason. Ladies and gentlemen, this case is about a 74-year-old woman who stepped onto her lawn holding roses. Her name was Margaret Johnson. She was a retired kindergarten teacher. She was unarmed. And Officer Brian Mitchell shot her dead because he was panicking, because he was reckless, and because he believed Lieutenant Garrett Hayes would make the problem disappear. The body camera footage played on screens throughout the courtroom. Jurors watched Mitchell fire without warning. Watched Margaret fall. Several jurors wiped their eyes. Mitchell stared at the defense table, his face gray. Hayes sat rigid, his lawyer whispering urgently, but the video was irrefutable. Then came the doorbell camera footage from Mr. Williams. Clearer angle. Better timestamp. Showing definitively that Margaret posed no threat, that Mitchell had fired at a fleeing suspect and killed an innocent woman instead. The ballistics expert testified that Mitchell's shot placement was consistent with spray and pray tactics, the kind of panicked shooting that would fail any qualification test. But the prosecution's nuclear weapon was Mitchell's own confession, recorded in that hotel room interview. His lawyer had objected, claiming coercion. The judge had reviewed the tape and ruled it admissible. Mitchell had been read his rights, offered counsel, and chose to talk because facing 15 years was better than facing 25. On screen, Mitchell explained how Hayes had coached him. How they'd edited the footage. How Hayes had threatened witnesses. All of it delivered in Mitchell's monotone voice, a man who'd realized too late that loyalty ran one direction. Hayes's defense tried to argue he'd been following department protocol, that cover-ups were standard practice. His lawyer realized the mistake 3 words in. Standard practice meant admitting the corruption was systemic, not isolated. The prosecution thanked him for the admission and promptly expanded the investigation to include 6 additional officers. The trial lasted 11 days. The jury deliberated for 90 minutes. Guilty on all counts for both defendants. Federal civil rights violations. Evidence tampering. Conspiracy. The judge set sentencing for 30 days later. When that day arrived, Marcus wore his dress uniform. Not to intimidate. To honor. His mother had been proud of his service, even when she didn't understand where he went or what he did. He owed her this, the sight of her son, standing tall, watching justice delivered with the same precision he'd once delivered violence. Mitchell received 15 years, eligible for parole in 10. Hayes received 23 years, with no parole possibility. The judge's statement was brief: "You didn't just kill Margaret Johnson. You killed trust. You killed accountability. You killed the belief that the badge means protection rather than privilege." Outside the courthouse, Marcus gave his only statement to the press. "My mother believed in redemption. She believed people could change. But she also believed in consequence. Today, the system worked the way it's supposed to. Not because I'm a Delta Force colonel. But because citizens like Mr. Williams and Mrs. Chen refused to be silent, and because federal prosecutors remembered that justice applies to everyone." 3 weeks later, Marcus retired from Delta Force. He'd served 20 years, earned his pension, and buried enough enemies for 3 lifetimes. The Margaret Johnson Foundation opened its doors with a staff of 12, former JAG officers, civil rights attorneys, and investigators who specialized in police misconduct cases. The foundation was funded entirely by the seized assets of Mitchell and Hayes, every dollar of their corruption now turned toward preventing the next Margaret Johnson. Marcus planted the coral roses in his mother's garden himself, on a Sunday morning that reminded him of the day she died. They bloomed that spring, vibrant, beautiful, and permanent. Every time a family called the foundation seeking help, every time a corrupt officer was held accountable, every time the system worked the way his mother believed it should, Marcus thought of those roses. Justice, he'd learned, didn't require violence. It required precision. Dedication. The same meticulous attention to detail that made him the Reaper. His mother had taught him right from wrong. Delta Force had taught him how to win. Together, those lessons had created something neither his enemies nor his allies expected: a man who could dismantle corruption with the same cold efficiency he'd once dismantled terrorist cells. The Reaper had retired. But the work, Margaret's work, would continue.